Okay, we're going to begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this new week and this opportunity to study together once again. We ask that you can unite our hearts and minds, that we can understand your word and the history that we are involved in. We just ask, Lord, for your Holy Spirit to be our teacher, that you can come close to each person with the particular needs that we have. And we're thankful for the sacrifice of your Son upon the cross and the work that he's done, not in the past only, but also in our personal lives. And we ask for this work to continue, that we may glorify your name upon the earth. Thank you for hearing our prayer. Be with us now as we study, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, good morning, everyone. Now we're going to get back to Jeff's paper, the May 1996 newsletter, or not newsletter, but article in our Firm Foundation magazine. But before we get there, I'm going to go to the whiteboard and draw out again these contrasting views regarding Daniel 11, verse 40. And Heidi and I went through it again yesterday. And I just find it fascinating what we're finding by looking at Millerite history. And their understanding of things. So we're going to go to the whiteboard here. Now, if we remember how Josiah Litch understood this, what did he see happening in 1798 or prior to 1798? So you have the 1260 years ending in 1798. And he's going to have, on February 15th, the Pope is going to be taken captive. And what power does this?
France.
What's that?
France.
Yeah, so it's going to be France. So what does he see happening prior to 1798? What do they see from verse 31 onward? Or is it verse 30? Yeah, I always get mixed up. Which verse is that? What's verse 31?
Daniel 11.
In Daniel 11. What's verse 31 start with?
Now the ships of heaven. No.
Okay, so that's dealing with the papacy. And when he gets to verse 36, how does that start?
And the king shall do according to
Yeah.
his will.
So it's in verse 36. So verse 31 to 35, he would be in agreement with us that that's referring to the papacy. But when they get to verse 36, and there's a bunch of things that are happening there, because remember, they have these time prophecies. And you have this prophecy, 31 AD to 330, that's 360 years. And that's from verse 24, I think it's Daniel 11, 24, and it's fulfilled in which verse? Where at the appointed time, is that at the time appointed, or the appointed time?
At the time of the end?
No. So in 24, it talks about even for a time.
35.
Yeah, and then it's verse 35 that it covers this period, correct?
That's right.
Now this is the seat So this would bring us to Revelation chapter 13, where it gives the dragon gives its power, seat, and great authority. So the dragon is paganism, pagan Rome, Satan as well. But you're going to have the power, seat, and great authority that are going to be given over to the papacy. But it's this here that happens. And then in verse 36, they're going to take this, Lich and Uriah Smith and others, they're going to see that the power that's referred to as a king is going to be talking about the French Revolution. So here you have the French Revolution and the events that follow it. So when they look at the king of the north and the king of the south, we know historically the king of the north and the king of the south have a battle, which is Raphia, and the king of the north is victorious over the king of this. It's the other way around. The king of the south is victorious over the king of the north. And then at Panium, the king of the north is victorious over the king of the south. Correct? So you have these battles, and these battles here, the king of the north and the king of the south, are addressing Greece. So when we get to 1798, they're now going to have the king of the north and the king of the south. But the king of the north is who, according to Lich?
Turkey.
Yeah, Turkey or Syria, more specifically. And the king of the south is Egypt, right? So they take this now as the literal nations of Syria and Egypt. And the problem that, of course, arises here is they haven't taken into account that we should be looking at these nations spiritually, that is, not literally, because the papacy is Babylon. We're not looking at Babylon as being Iraq, right? We're looking at Babylon as being a symbol. And the idea that I expressed is that just like in the week of Christ, you have this transition from earth to heaven, or from literal before the cross and spiritual after, the same thing occurs with the 1260s, so that this is pagan and this is papal, and papal is a counterfeit of the heavenly, and it's interpreted in symbols differently than paganism is. That is, paganism becomes a type of papalism. So when you get to the end here, if you're going to be dealing with literal nations, Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece, and Rome, when you get here, this should not be Rome, and any of the nations that are involved here should be used as symbols. So you shouldn't have Turkey or Syria and Egypt as literally being referred to in the prophecies that are dealing with the end of this period. Any thoughts on that? So I know that I've tried to make it as clear as I can. Is there any disagreement with that, or anybody who has something to add or a question? Now, the reason why this is important, why is this important that we understand what happened in Millerite history? What am I trying to say about this history?
So we don't repeat it again.
Okay. Well, we're going to repeat it.
Did we learn from their mistakes?
Yeah. but we still will repeat it because we're repeating this history. So why is it important then that we understand this history that we're going to repeat? Because if we're just going to repeat it, why does it matter that we understand it?
So then we can move on from it. I don't know what your question is.
Well, you're getting the right idea. The idea is that we can then understand what we have done. We can understand our history. So the whole idea of understanding the repeat of history is that as we're moving through our history, we have a reference point to understand where we are in our history. But just like in the past, we don't really understand where we are until we get there. Right? So that as we can imagine that we're further along the stream of time than we are, because of perspective. As we get closer to our destination, things become clearer. But if you're dealing with 1996 and how Jeff is understanding the fall of the Soviet Union, it changes as we move through history. You know, once we get the attack on the World Trade Center, that changes things. And then we have things that happen in our movement, predictions that are made, just like the Millerites made predictions, but they're based upon a lack of understanding of where we are in the stream of time. And we got confused about a lot of things. So, and that's understandable because the Millerites did the same thing. And so the fact that we do those things should be a point of encouragement, not a point of discouragement. So when we go back here, we have the king of the north and the king of the south. What's that?
I said those that followed Smith here, well, Litch and Smith, are now looking to Turkey to mark the close of probation for them.
Right. So yeah, they're going to be, which is crazy. I mean, maybe I shouldn't use that word, but it's inconsistent with how we understand prophecy. Because if you're looking to Turkey, where does that put the symbol of Babylon as referring to the papacy?
It's like it's completely off their screen.
Right.
Well, is it completely off their screen, or were they not following Miller's rules and what had been laid down before?
Well, yeah. And
I mean,
that's the question, because even was Litch really following Miller's rules correctly in making this application? Because Miller did this application as well. So the thing that we're going to find, or the things that we did find, is we went through this and we read through Litch's application of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, is what they saw happening is this battle between France, who is now going to be, instead of from verse 36, when it says the king shall do according to his will, this willful king, they're now going to say is France. And this is the French Revolution, and that he's going to come, or Syria is going to push against France. And they say push is a reference to a weak resistance, which of course makes no sense, because we know that the word push is a military term, which means to overcome and conquer a nation. And Syria did not push against France. So they're not following Miller's rules when it comes to comparing scripture with scripture. And then they're going to use, when France goes against Egypt and they lose, they're going to take that as the whirlwind, right? So they're going to be going through Daniel 11, verse 40, and describing events that we apply from 1989 onward. They're going to take those events and put them all in this history. And of course, that's understandable, right? Because they have, they don't even have October 22nd, 1844 in their sites, but they're before that. And they're looking at to the end of Miller's history. Now, as they go through history, some events are going to unfold. And one of them is the fall of the Ottoman Empire on August 11th, 1840. And remember, we went through this on Thursday, that they believed that this was a close of probation. And the reason they believed it was a close of probation has to do with this perspective that they had on France being the king or a king that's going to, the king of the south is going to push against him, and the king of the north is going to come against him like a whirlwind. And they're looking at France being embroiled in this battle, dealing with the Ottoman Empire and Egypt. And so they're looking to the end of the Ottoman Empire, this fall of this empire, as marking the close of probation. So they're going to put the close of probation here. It's the end of the second woe, which is the end of the sixth trumpet. And then they look at the trumpets, the sixth trumpet and the seventh trumpet and the seventh vial as beginning to sound. And so when the seventh trumpet begins to sound, that's the close of probation. And they know it happens right after Turkey falls in their scenario. So when we look at our time of the end, and we're now interpreting this history, we have the king of the north as the Pope and the USA, and the king of the south as Russia, or the USSR more correctly. So you have this event here. We have now interpreted it based upon Daniel 11 verse 40b. Because we took Daniel 11 verse 40a as our interpretation here, Daniel 11 verse 40a as the time of the end. And that's going to be the king of the south is France. And the king of the north is the papacy. So we have a different interpretation here. And their interpretation would not allow for any of this history afterwards. Everything would have to be tied up in this time. So again, from perspective, they're looking here where they are, and they're interpreting these events based upon where they believe they are in history. Because they believe Jesus is coming back in a few years. There would be no way that they could take this interpretation. But even the interpretation they have here is not following Miller's rules. You shouldn't have Syria and Egypt, who were Greece. They shouldn't be involved or embroiled literally in a battle happening here when the United States is being set up and the 1260 years are ending. They just shouldn't be connected with this history, because Rome is the one that establishes the vision. And so this is all about Rome. And here they're making this major battle with France. And what they're trying to say is at the time that this ends, this battle goes on. But they're going to take the fall of Turkey now as the beginning of the sounding of the seventh trumpet and the close of probation prior to October 22nd, 1844, really to the 1843. So there's a period of time here in which they believe that probation is closing. They're not sure exactly how it closes, but they're looking for a close of probation. So
There's a comment on the chat.
Okay, what's the comment? Because can somebody read it? Or because I can't.
The Millerite could not have understood the role of the U.S. would take compared to France, nor could they have understood fully the role of Islam in our time.
Right. Yeah, so it's understandable that they're going to try to make sense out of this prophecy in the best way that they can.
Well,
And yeah,
if you take a look at the situation that they have here, Chapter 3 of Miller's Evidences from Scripture and the History of the Second Coming.
mm-hmm.
His lens and view on these verses was colored because he believed that all of these things, all of these verses were going to be fulfilled between 1798 and 1843.
Yeah.
Now, when we take a look at what he had presented, he had a very, very different viewpoint. And again, this viewpoint was very colored because as he presented, at the time of the end of Antichrist, shall the king of the south, Spain, push at France, the Vendian War, and the king of the north, Great Britain, shall come against France like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and many ships, and the French, or Bonaparte, the principal ruler, shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Now, what would we say about this type of an interpretation today?
So what would we call it?
Yeah, what would we say about it?
Well, I mean, you're trying to interpret the Bible based upon current events.
No,
But
I-
as far as following the rules, you mean?
well, okay. Now, the point here is Miller was using a very literal
Yeah.
application.
Yeah.
In this case, again, he's trying to push this all into what he was seeing occurring between 1798 and 1843.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you get expositors, authors like Litch, Himes, and several others that were attempting to follow portions of what Miller was saying.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Miller was not off the mark in all cases.
No.
He had some other cases in reference to these verses where he did not take such a literal position.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem that is being faced, especially those that wish to elevate Uriah Smith, is that they wish to put Smith up in the level of a prophet similar to Ellen White.
Mm-hmm.
But Uriah Smith went even further, and in going so much further, he chose to fully set aside anything that had to do with Miller's rules.
Yes. Yeah.
So-
Now, one of the things about Miller, when it comes to his application of literal, Miller didn't quite always have the idea that, literal before the cross and spiritual after. He said that things should be taken literally unless it was obvious that they were meant to be understood as a symbol. And I think the way that they understood Daniel 11 was really a much more literal description of history than Daniel's other prophecies. Would you agree with that, what I've said there, Dwight?
I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah. And so, but this thing is, they're still using symbolism. So when they say even for a time, they're going to say, well, that's 360 years. So they're going to be interpreting some things as symbols, but trying to take other things quite literally. Now, this application that I've made here in regard to the 1260s this couldn't quite fully be comprehended by Miller. I mean, it could have if he would have made the parallel between Christ's week, but of course they didn't have this. So he didn't have the 70th week divided this way, so he couldn't have looked at these periods this way. But he could have at least seen that there's the 30 years before the 1260 and the 30 years, before Jesus's 3.5 years on earth. But even then he thought it was 7 years. So Miller he wouldn't have had the tools necessarily with what he understood to interpret it that way. But he did have the rules that we're using to now see this, that we can take the 1260 and divide it in this way and say paganism is really dealing with a more literal history. But when you get to the papacy, you now have to apply things spiritually. And to define what spiritual is just that it's not literal, that is, it's done in symbols. So the king of the north and the king of the south here are now symbols. They're not referring to Syria and Egypt or to Turkey and Egypt. And so when we look at our history and how we interpreted this, I think what's important is understanding, and this is what I'm trying to get to, and we're going to come back to this again and again, because as we look at our history in 1989, we now have an interpretation where the USSR is understood to be the counterpart of France. And we know that France is about atheism and hedonism, right? That it's Sodom and Egypt. And this is true of the USSR as well. So you have the same problem with the USSR. But when the Soviet Union falls here in 1989, what is Jeff looking to that would parallel what they see as this history? Because remember, this is before 9/11, just as initially here they're before the fall of Turkey. So when Lich is making these predictions about the fall of Turkey, he's looking to something in the future. What is Jeff looking to in the future that he's seeing where he's leading?
All that he had was the Sunday law.
Yeah, so he's looking for the Sunday law, right? He's not looking for 9/11. And the Sunday law is going to end up being a symbol that now eventually gets attached to October 22nd, 1844. So, and we're going to see how that happens as we go through this history, studying what happens.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Mark.
I asked Jeff. I asked Jeff how he do that to change the picture on his Zoom.
Okay.
I like that.
You like the planets?
Yes.
Okay, great. Glad you like it.
I ask you how you do.
I just
How
put
you do the pictures on there.
I just put the camera up on a picture of the planets. Just pointing at the picture. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so when we look at this history now, we know that Jeff is looking to the Sunday law. That's his main focus, because he's taking Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, and he's now seeing, this isn't talking about this history here. After you have the king of the south push at the king of the north, the Pope's taken captive, and then all of this intervening history, in a sense, is erased in regard to this prophecy, and we jump all the way to 1989 and the events that happened there with the fall of the Soviet Union. And so he's going to see that those verses 41 to 45 are dealing about the coming Sunday law. Now, he's not going to understand 9/11 as being a part of that. And we don't really put 9/11 in there, right? So in order to understand 9/11 properly, we have to understand this history properly, right? So Josiah Litch's prophecy, he has a prophecy regarding the king of the north and the king of the south, but he also has a prophecy regarding Turkey itself, the fall of Turkey. And so he believes that the fall of Turkey is this event that he's looking for. So this is why we're going to go through this history in a lot more detail to understand this history, because in order to understand what we've been through, we need to understand this history. And I believe that we haven't understood it correctly. That is, we haven't really addressed this problem in Millerite history because we didn't see it. We didn't understand about the close of probation that they were marking as coming. And that close of probation is, in a sense, paralleling what we would say is the Sunday law, not just the close of probation, like in how we've looked at it. Somebody had a comment? Okay. Yeah, so
No.
no one had a comment? Okay, so we're going to come back to this this week, because I want to establish this week. I'm not going to get it all done today in trying to understand the parallel between Millerite history and our history. So I'm going to go back to the May 1996 article. There we go. Now, we had been reading, dealing with the interpretation that Jeff has regarding, and I'm going to go over this again, because this is going to be a real key. And this was that quote from Education, page 228. I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. The centralizing of wealth and power, the vast combinations for the enriching of the few at the expense of the many, the combinations of the poorer classes for the defense of their interests and claims, the spirit of unrest, of riot and bloodshed, the worldwide dissemination of the same teachings that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France. Now, we have already understood that Jeff has applied this. He's taking this quote of Ellen White, and he's using it to look at the rise of the Soviet Union. And we know that Jeff, when he taught that the Soviet Union fell in 1989, that is the end of the Soviet Union, and that opens up the way for the final events dealing with the Sunday law. That's the way he's initially looking at it. And in 1996, that's how he's looking at it. The Sunday law is coming because the Soviet Union has now fallen. And the similarity to that would in some ways be in relationship to Turkey, that they're looking at Turkey has fallen or is going to fall, and then that's leading to those final events. Now, there are some differences here in where they're placing things and also where Jeff is in this line. So then it says, tracing the history of the Soviet Union's conquests through the following years is enlightening in many ways. First is the fact that as country after country came under the control of this kingdom, a primary mode to accomplish such feat was revolution. So he's looking at revolution, but what is it that we're seeing right now in the United States? Can we say that this statement in Education is actually referring to our time and not to the time, or not at least not primarily to the time of the rise of the Soviet Union, that it's referring to the rise of atheism and hedonism in the United States? So that's the question. is it talking more to our time?
Definitely. We really are seeing that.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have seen this
I
in
have
1996.
still asked Jeff one putting how he pays that picture on there.
He just pointed his camera at a picture.
Just taped it up on the wall with a piece of tape.
Yeah,
I am asking you, Jeff, a, a question. Do you pick a picture from the online to paste it on your camera?
No, I just bought it from the store, the bookstore. A picture of it.
But right now I'm not going to the bookstore.
okay, Mark, I'll help you with this tonight, okay? So that you can get that picture. I'll find it all for you and I'll send
I
it to you.
am asking him
Yeah, but he
how
just got it at the store.
I am asking how to paste it on there.
I just used tape, regular tape, clear tape, Scotch tape.
I pick
Mark?
one picture online to save to my picture library. What one I want to choose be picture on there.
Okay, Mark, we'll deal with this later because you're being a little bit rude here. We got to talk about this
Sorry.
topic. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah, we'll talk about this later. Okay.
Video.
Yeah.
Give me the phone number. I want to keep talking to him how you do the piece.
Okay. So, okay, Mark, if Jeff wants to give the phone number, he can send it to you through the chat. Okay. But he's in the United States, so
it is funny. It is funny right now.
okay, Mark, we got to stop. Mark, we got to get back to the study. Okay.
Yeah, but it is funny. I don't have pen and paper now with me.
Okay, Mark, I have to put you on mute. He can send it to you. We can figure this out afterwards. Okay, we got to keep going. So
I am in a bed.
I know. We'll deal with this after the study. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know.
Okay. So let's move on ahead. So we look at this statement from Education 228, and they said we're agreeing that what we see in the statement of Ellen White is describing what is currently happening in the United States. Jeff could not have seen this back in 1996 because he's just looking at the fall of the Soviet Union. And he's looking from his perspective that the Sunday law is coming very, very soon. And they're focused upon the connection between the evangelicals and the papacy. And we'll see that when we read through some of these studies here, and especially as we read studies after 1996 leading up to the year 2000, the focus that Jeff has on what's happening in the world. And it's very much a parallel to what we see happening in Millerite history. And so to figure out where we are in our line, we need to understand the Millerite line better than we do. And especially the first part. So that is, we often focus on the Millerite line after 1840, as far as the teachings that occur after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and leading up to those events through that's the 1533 days from August 11th to October 22nd, 1844. So leading to the first disappointment and then to the great disappointment. So in trying to sort through this, what we're starting to see, and I don't know how many other people are seeing it in the way that I'm seeing it, that we're repeating Millerite history in ways that we didn't really expect. And that has to do with the parallel between our teachings and theirs. So when Jeff is looking at this statement from education and he's applying it to the past, basically, he's not applying it to the future. He's not looking that that's what's going to happen necessarily in the future. That is, he's seeing this war between atheism and the United States as describing this struggle, but he's not really aware that that goes on in the United States itself. So he's tracing the history of the Soviet Union. Now, he is going to say here, another aspect of this growth is that almost all the countries which were eventually brought under the umbrella of the Soviet Union had previously been Catholic-dominated nations. One by one, Catholicism is losing its power base, or was losing its power base. So he's going to look at this conflict between the Soviet Union and the papacy as this primary conflict. So this is the king of the North and the king of the South. So what happens to this movement later on? What do we see about Jeff's prediction? What does Jeff see in at the end of 2016? What is it that we discover about this?
That Russia is still a player.
Okay, so we take the view that the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't that it never went to the head. This overflowing and passing over only went up to the neck, right? It never covered or destroyed this element. Now, what makes the Soviet Union the king of the South?
Their opposition to the king of the North.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I would say it that way. I mean,
I'm kind of going around what we used to teach.
yeah, well, I would say the thing is it's atheism and hedonism, right? So it inherits those aspects that France had, which we applied spiritually. When we say that it was Sodom and Egypt, when we apply that to France, when France ceases to be atheistic, it becomes a Christian nation of sorts, if you want to call it that. And the aspects of socialism, atheism, and all these different things that identified France in the French Revolution, when you have the Soviet Revolution, we now see that that has passed on. And so that's the way that Jeff is looking at it. The teachings that led to the French Revolution are the same teachings that lead to the Soviet Revolution. And so he looks at the Soviet Union as Sodom and Egypt. So what did we discover then when we found that it passed to Russia? How was it that we were understanding the head? What was the head? In more specifically, it's
well, geographically, the Russian territory,
yeah,
as opposed to the satellites.
Yeah, so we used Isaiah chapter 7, dealing with the country, of Syria. There it's talking about Syria. Damascus is the head of Syria. That's the capital. And so that would be Moscow. But then when it comes to the head of Syria is Reason, right, in Isaiah chapter 7. So if you're going to look at what the head of the Soviet Union is, what would we say it was? Is it Moscow or is it something else that's the head? You understand what I'm asking? Because you got the country, the capital, and then the king. Right? That's how it describes it, both for Israel, and which is Samaria, and Ephraim, Samaria, and then Pekah, right? So you have this 3 stages. So when we said Russia was the head, what were we saying in 2017?
Well, we had to include Moscow and whoever the current ruler was.
Okay, so we would now look at the ruler, right? So you would place maybe Putin at the present time, right? Now, what's the problem with that?
It's becoming too literal.
Okay, it's becoming too literal. Okay, good. So I'm not saying that we're completely wrong in recognizing that there was a problem, that when the Soviet Union fell, that the head had not been removed. But based upon this statement from Education 228, if you're going to look at the French Revolution, what is it that passed to the Soviet Union? Was it a person?
Atheism.
It was atheism. It was an ideology, right? So when the Soviet Union fell, was that the end of communism?
No.
No. And what we've actually seen is actually the rise of communism. But it happened under our noses and almost without us perceiving it, because it happened so secretly and so rapidly. Now, the way that it occurred in the West, how did it occur? How did we get to the point where we are looking at socialism, or really communism, or despotic, dictatorships as a way of solving our problems? How did it get there? Where did it come from? Does anybody know?
It's always sort of been latent, even from the McCarthy era.
Okay, well, I know exactly where it came from because I've been studying this. And it came from our universities. The reason why we have socialism is so popular in the United States has to do with the education of our young people. So parents did not know that they were sending their children to universities to become activists and socialists. They never understood that postmodernism was really a destruction of the American Constitution. That's the purpose of postmodernism, is it's iconoclastic. It's meant to destroy. And so I've been following this history and getting to understand this history of what happened in the United States. So while Americans were basically conservatives, their children have been educated to be socialists, to be communists. And it happened through education and also through the entertainment world. So music, movies, television, video games, all these types of things have been preparing the young people to believe in an ideology that is really Sodom and Egypt. Does that make sense to people?
Yes, we've created our own cultural time bomb, and it's going off now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Dwight?
It's a little deeper than what you're beginning to address.
Okay.
Because if you take a good look at the history, we know that the Russian Revolution occurred 1917, 1918.
Yeah.
But by the time that Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, he was enamored with what the socialists were doing in Germany and what was going on in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So both Hitler and Stalin recognized a kindred spirit in Roosevelt. And the problem is that his indoctrination had occurred even earlier under that with Wilson.
Yeah. No, so there's no doubt that communism has had a footing in the United States for a long time. Now, in the McCarthy era, they tried to get rid of it because they understood what it was. But the media really misrepresents that whole history of what Americans were trying to do to protect themselves from communism. So what it did is it had to move to the schools. You couldn't just have the elite believing in something when you have a populace that is basically Protestant and also conservative. So in order to get to where we got to, it had to come through the educational system. So you had to, those older people who had worked hard and understood, practical things, they had to be replaced by basically a hedonistic youth who had been raised, through the sexual revolution of the 60s, and the free love and all the pot smoking and all these drugs and all these different things, the entertainment that they had, and then the education that they experienced in universities, to come to the point where they would actually despise free speech, despise the Constitution as some kind of, white patriarchal control mechanism to take away our freedoms. And the thing that's interesting is that we had part of our movement actually had bought into that. And it was mostly the young people that bought into it because they had been educated this way without even knowing it. And so, this term boomers, which I heard thrown around at the School of the Prophets by the young people, it wasn't just some little joke. It was an insidious marker of what was actually happening in this movement, that young people believed that they knew better than old people. And that's part of a revolution. You see this in communist China. When it became communist, the old people were overthrown by the young. And so the same things happened in our movement, and is happening in the United States right now.
Would we say that the Jesuits have infiltrated the education system?
Yes. So another thing is, Ryan brought up a book which he lent me to read, which was called Ecclesiastical Megalomania. But it really just addresses the Catholic Church is socialistic. That is, it's communistic in its roots, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about here with when you see this depiction of the papacy and Litch and Uriah Smith and others interpret that as atheism, because there really is not much difference between the Catholic Church and the ideals of the Soviet Union. They're really very similar. But the only difference is that the Catholic Church wanted to be in control. So there wasn't really, Catholics are not conservative. The belief, the religion is not conservative. So yeah, the Jesuits definitely have a part to play in it. But it doesn't need to be Jesuits themselves doing this, because the ideology itself is what's infectious. And it's the result, or it has a fertile field to grow in when you have indolent youth, people who are coddled, people who are privileged, to not understand the price that was paid for the freedoms. They will readily give up their freedom for a mess of pottage. Right? And that's what's happening. People really believe that you can just have your cake and eat it too. So using a few little metaphors or sayings there. But you understand the point. It doesn't have to be the Jesuits who do it. You know, it's not like the Jesuits had to come in and infiltrate in order to get these ideas there. These ideas are there, you know, in many different ways. And so America was a fertile field for that because of what happened. First, in the revolution in the 60s should not be discounted. And that's a result of other things that went before. So I always worried about what would happen when the pot smoking hippies became the leaders of our country. And now I know. So when we go through this part here, dealing with the ships, the military power, we read some of this. I think we're over here. The King of the North, the papacy, was grieved when it lost its political power in 1798. In Daniel 11, verse 30, the emperors of the Roman Empire had been grieved by their inability to resist the onslaught of the three horns of Daniel 7, representing the Goths, Vandals, and Heruli. France became the first Catholic nation when its king Clovis dedicated his nation to removing these three horns. The recent historical record describing the fall of the Soviet Union echoes the history of Clovis as it identifies the military and economic pressure supplied by the United States, coming to the aid of the papacy to sweep away the southern kingdom. Daniel 11:40 states that when the king of the north sweeps away the southern kingdom, he shall enter into the countries. This clause pinpoints that the king of the south would be a confederacy of countries. That was certainly true of the former Soviet Union and its many satellite countries. Sister White makes a statement which will allow us to test the scenario we have just set forth against the testimony of the historical record. So this quote from Second Selected Messages, we've heard a lot. Historical events showing the direct fulfillment of prophecy were set before the people, and the prophecy was seen as a figurative delineation of events leading down to the close of this earth's history. The scenes connected with the working of the man of sin are the last features plainly revealed in this earth's history. As the historical events associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union were recorded by the secular press, we find the history of the ongoing war between atheism and Catholicism described. The alliance between the United States and the papacy is addressed, including the military and economic role played by the United States. Incredibly, we find the authors of these secular articles were frequently led to choose words in illustrating their stories, which are the same words found in the biblical description of verse 40. God intends for his people to see that these historical events are direct fulfillment of prophecy. God would have us recognize the sequence of events as a wake-up call to Laodicea. So he's going to have some quotes from different newspapers, you know, and I could always think of, like, you know, the Days of the Whirlwind. That was a Time magazine where they reveal the history of what had happened in 1989 and leading up to it with the fall of the Soviet Union. I can't remember when it was published, but it was sometime after the events in 1989. Because when those events happened, when the wall came down, it wasn't really evidence of what had happened behind the scenes yet. That history came out afterwards.
Yeah, the magazine was called Days of the Whirlwind, was Newsweek.
Newsweek, okay, so that was Newsweek.
And then the Time magazine was the Holy Alliance.
Yeah, the Holy Alliance was the Time, okay. And the Holy Alliance goes into the details behind it, right? And the Days of the Whirlwind, though, they're still both written well after 1989, correct?
Well, I think the Newsweek one was like December.
Okay, so it was
1989. I think it was quite recent.
okay.
After, but the Time magazine was, I think, was 1992.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for those clarifications. I remember hearing about what had happened. Basically, the Time magazine article on CBC Radio would have been in about 1992 or 93 or something like that I started to hear about what had happened behind the scenes. When the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, now Gorby's Vow to the Roman Legions is the title in the US News and World Report. When the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV decided to seek pardon of Pope Gregory VII in 1077, he stood barefoot for 3 days in the snow outside the papal quarters at Canossa, Italy. Gorbachev's concordat with the church was no less significant in its way. So that's time, December 11th, 1989. The Soviet President's session Friday with Pope John Paul II is the latest development of a revolution in the communist world that the Pope helped spark. Gorbachev has allowed to happen. So until recently, the battalions of Marxism seemed to have the upper hand over the soldiers of the cross. In the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, Lenin had pledged toleration, but delivered terror. Russia turned crimson with the blood of martyrs, says Father Gleb Yakunin, Russian Orthodoxy's bravest agitator for religious freedom, in the Bolsheviks' first 5 years in power. 28 bishops and 1,200 priests were cut down by the Red Sickle. Stalin greatly accelerated the terror, and by the end of Khrushchev's rule, liquidation of the clergy reached an estimated 50,000. After World War II, fierce but generally less bloody persecution spread into the Ukraine and the new Soviet bloc, affecting millions of Russian Catholics, or Roman Catholics, and Protestants as well as Orthodox. So again, that's from the Time magazine, December 4th, 1989. In private meetings with heads of state, backroom consultations with dissident groups, and persistent propagandizing for his crusade against tyranny, he, John Paul II, has helped bring about the greatest political change since the Russian Revolution. That's from Life magazine, December 1989. His Pope, John Paul II's triumphant tour of Poland in 1979, says Polish bishop, altered the mentality of fear and the fear of tanks, of losing your job, of not getting promoted, of being thrown out of school, of failing to get a passport. People learned that if they ceased to fear the system was helpless. Thus was born Solidarity, backed by the church and led by such friends of the Pope as Lech Walesa and Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who subsequently became the Soviet bloc's first Christian prime minister. So in 1935, Joseph Stalin, absolute ruler of the Soviet Union, was given some unsolicited advice. And we know about that story where he's talked about he should basically acquiesce to the Pope. And he says, the Pope, and how many divisions has he? The answer then was that he has none. The answer now is that he needs none. The structures of communism are crumbling to the touch. The rush of freedom in Eastern Europe is a sweet victory for John Paul II, and December 1989. Yeah, so there's a note there by Awaken Ministries. Okay, so if you want to read that. The word rush in this verb used to describe the spread of this freedom. He shall overflow or rush and pass through. The word pushed was chosen by this author to describe the war when communism was waging against Catholicism. Of all the events that have shaken the Soviet bloc in 1989, none is more fraught with history or more implausible than the polite encounter to take place this week in Vatican City. There in the spacious ceremonial library of the 16th century Apostolic Palace, the Tsar of the world, atheism, Mikhail Gorbachev, will visit the Vicar of Christ, Pope John Paul II. The moment will be electric, not only because John Paul helped inflame the fervor for freedom in his Polish homeland that swept like brush fire across Eastern Europe. Beyond that, the meeting of the two men symbolizes the end of the 20th century's most dramatic spiritual war, the conflict in which the seemingly irresistible force of communism battered against the immovable object of Christianity. So this is the one statement that I really think that we could look at. So this is a dramatic spiritual war. So it's not a literal war. Now, what were we looking to occur with the King of the North and the King of the South at Rafi and Panium?
Literal war again.
literal war, right? Which is kind of peculiar. Now, initially,
Malin,
what's that?
check the chat.
Yeah, I read the chat, so you can read that. So when we deal with this literal war, but we look at that this is talked about as a spiritual warfare or spiritual war, dramatic spiritual war occurred. Why would we look at it as a literal war?
We're seeing literal countries opposing each other.
Okay, so literal countries. But when we look at the Soviet Union, it's not really much about the country. It's more about the things that made the Soviet Union what it were not its literal aspects.
They had a cultural revolution.
Yeah, it was its spiritual aspects. That is the symbols. When I talk about spiritual, I mean symbolic. It's Sodom and Egypt, just as France was. So what made France the king of the South wasn't that it was the literal country inhabiting the South. It was that it had the characteristics of Egypt. It also had the characteristics of Sodom, which is also South, right? So it has Sodom and Egypt, the characteristics of the South. And so the papacy, it took upon the characteristics of the king of the North because of its for different reasons, and I want to go into those some other time. We're going to look at why we would take the papacy as the king of the North, besides the fact that it clearly took over the northern territory. It occupied that territory and had that aspect. But there's more to it about being the king of the North. It has to do with its exaltation on the sides of the North. So we're going to deal with that when we try to understand the king of the North and the king of the South in our time, what that means. So you have this battle between the king of the North and the king of the South in 1798, and then in 1989. But when we started to recognize that the Soviet Union, when it fell, that wasn't the end of it wasn't the end of the head. The problem is trying to decide what the head was. So we took that the head is Russia. What would be the problem with that when you make the head Russia? What are we doing interpretation-wise?
We're going from spiritual to literal.
Yeah, we're starting to go back to literal. So the characteristic that made Russia Russia was atheism and hedonism. And so that did not end with the Soviet Union. Communism did not really fall, right? As we're trying to look at this. So I think this is an important point that we have to keep in mind. While Gorbachev's handoff policy was the immediate cause of the chain reaction of liberty that had swept through Eastern Europe in the past few months, John Paul deserves much of the longer range credit, which I like that term long range, because that's how the papacy thinks. Here the word swept is used, and to sweep away is the definition for come against like a whirlwind. This event is described as the 20th century's most dramatic spiritual war, while identifying Gorbachev as the czar of the world. Atheism is synonymous with being the czar of the world. And communism, world communism. Secular authorities recognize communism as atheism. The triumph of Paul II, the tide of freedom washing over Eastern Europe, answers this most fervent prayer. The word overflow means to wash away as with water. Who was choosing the words of these secular reporters? Right, so washing over Eastern Europe. Days of the Whirlwind, title in Newsweek, December 25th, 1989. For an article that is a chronology of the falls of communism, the author thought the best title for the article was the same word Daniel twice used to prophetically describe the very same event. So, and it's interesting, the date is December 25th, 1989, right? because it's going to be 2 years later that's the end of the Soviet Union, the December 25th, 1991. Okay. So it's going to deal here with the chariots and horsemen. So this is the United States part to play. In 1981, the communist bloc got another shock. A new American president, Ronald Reagan, began fulfilling his promise to challenge the Soviets, not placate them. Over the next few years, he accelerated the military buildup and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based system for protecting against missile attack, which was, we refer to it as Star Wars. He backed anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, Angola, Cambodia, and Afghanistan. And with American troops, he liberated the island of Grenada from communist thugs, or Grenada, however it's pronounced. The Soviets' confidence was shaken. The Western Europeans also pressured the Soviets. NATO forged ahead with military modernization. German voters spurned Soviet peace overtures and elected a government that voted to deploy new intermediate range missiles. Military pressure from America and its Western allies had caused the Soviets to flinch. So this is Reader's Digest, March 1990. So some months after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Gorbachev has also grasped the fact that political and economic survival depends upon the goodwill of the Soviet people, among whom Christians have always outnumbered communists. Gorbachev, moreover, needs the cooperation of the West, observes Father Mark, a reform-minded Orthodox priest in Moscow, who considers Gorbachev's program within the USSR a result of foreign policy necessity. 1980s communist economies, always inefficient, went belly up. Before they had lacked consumer and luxury goods, now perennial shortages of staples worsened as well. When Soviet miners went on strike in 1989, their demands included soap, toilet paper, and sugar. For Gorbachev, the ferment in the Baltics is shaking not just a small corner of the empire built by Lenin and Stalin, but the foundations of the empire itself. The nationalities question is a potent distillation of many other signs, from a crumbling economy to violent ethnic clashes. But the breathtaking disintegration of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe may not stop at the Soviet border. As the economy deteriorates and shortages grow, public disillusionment with communism and with Gorbachev himself is rising, and hostile republics, nationalities, and interest groups are competing more fiercely for political power and for shares in the shrinking economy. Corruption and crime are rampant. Miners and railway workers threaten to cut off fuel supplies during the bitter winter. Azerbaijanis cut the rail line to an Armenian enclave in their midst. Farmers hoard food, leaving city shelves bare. So that's U.S. News and World Report, January 15th, 1990. So a lot of this is old history that, some of us lived through. And some of us, it's really old history. In Poland, the freedom movement was born almost 3 decades ago when the Bishop of Krakow sought approval to build a new church. When communist authorities denied his application, the bishop had a giant cross erected and celebrated open-air masses. The communists tore it down. The church members replaced it over and over until finally the communists gave up. Who was that Bishop of Krakow? None other than Pope John Paul II. With the Pope's support, Solidarity, Polish labor union was formed, and John Paul II sent word to Moscow that if Soviet forces crushed Solidarity, he would go to Poland and stand with his people. When Tadeusz Mazowiecki took over in August of 1989 as Poland's first non-communist prime minister in 45 years, he was asked if he was a socialist. "I'm a Catholic," he answered tersely, which means he was a socialist. But anyway, last year's Lithuania's 2 leading bishops were returned to head diocese after a combined 53 years of internal exile, and the Cathedral of Vilnius, previously used as an art museum, was restored for worship. This year, the Belarusian Republic got its first bishop in 63 years. that paved the way for Archbishop Angelo Sodano, who oversees the Vatican's foreign relations, to make the arrangements for Gorbachev's historic visit to the Holy See. These concessions to Catholicism are only part of Gorbachev's religious liberalization. So, as you look at this history and you start to think about Jeff's perspective in 1996, what is Jeff seeing happening? What were we seeing as Seventh-day Adventists that was occurring in the 1990s?
Fulfillment of prophecy.
Okay, we see fulfillment of prophecy, you're saying? Yeah, so we see prophecy being fulfilled, right? But what is it that we're seeing as far as what's coming up? How did we perceive what was coming? For those of us that were Adventists in the 90s.
Well, we just saw an open door for evangelism, but it wasn't much else.
Okay, well, that's what the church saw. I'm not saying that, I don't think that that's what most Adventists saw. Or maybe it's most. But I'm talking about Bible students who were believing that this was a fulfillment of prophecy. What were we seeing was happening? How did we interpret these events prophetically? Maybe we can't remember that long ago.
Yeah, I can't remember much other commentary other than what Jeff was saying and
Okay. Well, for me,
himself.
for who wasn't following Jeff in the 90s, is we saw the fall of the Soviet Union, and we saw that we would then have, we saw that the United States had joined the hands with the papacy in order to cause this overthrow. So we felt that the last events would be rapid ones, that a Sunday law would be coming soon, that the United States evangelical, so we were looking mostly at what was happening in the ecumenical world. How was the Catholic Church, with that connection that happened in the fall of the Soviet Union, how was that leading to the uniting of Protestants with Catholics? And how was this going to lead to the Sunday law? That was what we were looking at. So we're looking at a Sunday law that's coming because now the Soviets are out of the way, right? That atheism has been destroyed and the world's going to become really religious, right? That was at least the way that it was depicted, is that we're going to, there's going to be this backlash. And what you're going to see is you're going to see the world becoming more religious. And then you're going to have economic problems occur. And then we're going to call for the Pope to be the head of everything. And that's kind of the scenario that was predominant in the 90s amongst conservative Adventists. Now, what we end up saw happening was actually
I remember
something.
Jeff looking at
Keep going.
looking at the moral majority very closely.
Right. So we're following the moral majority, looking at what's happening with, are we going to get some kind of evangelical president of the United States? Maybe one of those evangelicals will lead. We're not really knowing about globalism in the way that we understand it now. That wasn't really part of our thinking. And definitely we weren't concerned about communism. Communism, in a sense, had to be taken out of the way in order for Protestantism to arise. So that's the way that I understood it in the 90s.
Comment on the chat.
Yeah, I'm just reading here about, with Jeff, theologians who recognized it as a fulfillment of prophecy. I mean, I obviously looked at it as a fulfillment of prophecy when the wall came down. But I think that when the Soviet Union fell, the problem with the church itself is that they were focused upon evangelism. They weren't focused that much on prophecy. But as far as conservative Adventists were concerned, we were looking for the coming Sunday law. The moral majority was one of those terms that was always bandied around. So So this is what Jeff has seen. In 1996, he's seen the end of communism and the rise of evangelical Christianity in connection with the papacy. And so you're going to see that he's focused upon these concessions being made between these different denominations and the different meetings that are happening. That's going to be really what characterizes Jeff's newsletters and studies leading up to 2001 to September 11th. The focus is on this coming Sunday law. So when we get to 2001, we'll deal with that, but that changed things to some degree. But one thing is, it's really hard to change. We have to have a lot of things happen in this movement for us to get to look back at our history and try to understand it. But the other thing that was happening, that happened even more clearly with 9/11, was an opening up of Millerite history began. And that took some time. So I came into the movement in 2010. And in 2010, we really hadn't moved on that much from a lot of these earlier ideas as far as the lines were concerned. We now had 9/11, and we were sorting out 9/11 in 2010 still. And it had been 2004 maybe that we had these first presentations dealing with trying to understand 9/11 as a waymark. So when I came in, we still hadn't had the Midnight in the Midnight Cry placed correctly. A lot of things we didn't have that we later had. So in order to understand these lines, going back over this history, and I know I'm repeating myself, but we can't understand this history of what happened in this movement unless we understand its parallel to the Millerite history. So that's going to be part of it. And we can see here he's looking at the events of the day and interpreting them as best he can. So he can see that this definitely is about this fulfillment of prophecy. He's got it right regarding Daniel 11, verse 40b. Time magazine, February 24th, 1992, chose the title Holy Alliance to discuss this coming together of the United States and the Vatican as they sought to bring down communism. The magazine elaborates on the secret nature of this alliance and the closeness of the Vatican and leadership of the United States. It draws the connection between the Vatican and the labor unions, identifying solidarity as one of the main players in this intrigue. It also labels the use of our military, the CIA, labor unions, and finance as key tools in this collaboration. Only President Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II were present in the Vatican Library on Monday, June 7th, 1982. There we go. It was the first time the two had met, and they talked for 50 minutes. In that meeting, Reagan and the Pope agreed to undertake a clandestine campaign to hasten the dissolution of the communist empire, declares Richard Allen, Reagan's first national security advisor. This was one of the great secret alliances of all time. Reagan came in with very simple and strongly held views, said Admiral Bobby Inman, a former deputy director of the CIA. It is a valid point of view that he saw the collapse of communism coming, and he pushed it hard. During the first half of 1982, a five-part strategy emerged that was aimed at bringing about the collapse of the Soviets' economy. The U.S. defense buildup already underway, aimed at making it too costly for the Soviets to compete militarily with the U.S. Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, became the centerpiece of strategy. Covert operations aimed at encouraging reform movements in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Financial aid in war to Warsaw Pact nations calibrated their willingness to protect human rights and undertake political and free market reforms. Economic isolation of the Soviet Union and the withholding of Western and Japanese technology from Moscow. The administration focused on denying the USSR what it had hoped would be its principal source of hard currency in the 21st century, profits from a transcontinental pipeline to supply natural gas to Western Europe. And then increased use of Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe to transmit the administration's messages to the people of Eastern Europe. Like all great and lucky leaders, the Pope and President exploited the forces of history to their ends. An incredible part of this history is that God, through Daniel, concisely described these events in just one verse containing only 50 words, which is pretty interesting statement. Now we're just going to finish off here this reading here. It says, in his book, Keys of This Blood, Malachi Martin, a Vatican insider, goes to great pains to illustrate the attempted assassination of the Pope was viewed by John Paul II as divine evidence that he should be the Pope to ascend to the throne of the world. The Pope saw his attempted assassination as a sign from Mary, confirming the message sent to the Catholic Church and to the world through the supernatural manifestation of the so-called Virgin of Fatima, Portugal. So you can see this Fatima, which is something that Tess also presented. It was the fact that she presented this, the miracle of Fatima, in the context of this line of Catholicism, really, I think, intrigued Jeff. And I think it's one of the things that caught him off guard. But anyway, so Jeff was writing about this Fatima issue. This miracle and the messages connected to it are the guiding force for Catholicism as it prepares for the next millennium of peace. The Fatima miracle was specific information concerning communism, Russia, and the conversion of the world. Strangely enough, this miracle occurred in 1917, the very year of the Bolshevik Revolution. The healing of the deadly wound identifies the restoration of power to the papacy as a geopolitical power. The Vatican lost its throne in 1798 when the King of the South began a war against the King of the North. It is also noteworthy that the 1981 assassination attempt against the Pope, the King of the North, was apparently ordered by the King of the South, the Soviet Union. In a caption connected with two photographs showing the assassination attempts on both the Pope and Ronald Reagan, the following statement was made. A common brush with death. At their first meeting, Reagan and John Paul II discussed something else they had in common. Both had survived assassination attempts that occurred only 6 weeks apart in 1981, and both believed God had saved them for a special mission, and both referred to the miraculous fact that they had survived. In May 1981, before a vast audience in St. Peter's Square, Pope John Paul was shot and severely wounded by Mehmet Ali Agca. There was immediate speculation that the Turkish gunmen had been sent by East Bloc plotters from Bulgaria, sponsored by the Soviet secret police. Their aim, to silence the one man capable of shaking the foundations of international communism. With the Pope's support, Solidarity, the Polish Labor Union, was formed, and John Paul II sent a word to Moscow that if Soviet forces crushed Solidarity, he would go to Poland and stand with his people. The Soviets were so alarmed that they hatched a plot to kill him. The Pope cautioned Solidarity leaders, particularly his friend Lech Walesa, to proceed slowly. They did. In 1988, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, the Polish communist leader, went to them offering a deal. Solidarity insisted on an election, which it carried with some 80% of the vote. I remember that. When communist government fell, the impact on Eastern Europe was electrifying. That's from Reader's Digest, March 1990. The final movements in the healing of the deadly wound of the papacy had begun. And ironically, the reigning Pope himself received a deadly physical wound during this time period. The fulfillment of Daniel 11:40 is the first step of 3 steps which are necessary for the complete healing of the papacy's deadly wound. The first step is now past history. The historical record of the war between these two kingdoms confirms that it continued to the very end. The next area of conquest for the Vatican is the glorious land of the United States. So that's going to be dealing with the Sunday law. Possibly the most significant point of verse 40 is that the United States has already formed an alliance with the enemy, which is preparing to bring her under his control. And this is an echo of how the papacy originally came into the control of the world. For just as Clovis surrendered his pagan beliefs when he came to the aid of the papacy, likewise the United States surrendered its Protestant beliefs when it came to the aid of the papacy. This is true because to meet the definition of Protestant, one must protest popery and maintain a firm denial of any pope, any type of alliance with Catholicism. We will address the consequences of this alliance as we continue this series. So we can see that the perspective that Jeff has is a perspective from the 1990s, and yet he's getting so many things right. But more than that, we can look back at this and we can see that there's something that he can't see, and that is we can see what's happening today. And what's happening today is hinted at in his statements and the choices of statements that he has. So, and the fact that this is a spiritual battle, a spiritual war that goes on, I think is something we have to take into account when we look at how we corrected our misunderstanding and why we came to the conclusions that we did. So that's going to be something that's going to be ongoing as we look at this history. We'll constantly be comparing it with what has happened since 1996, since these events. And any final thoughts before we close with prayer? Something that I need to bring out or I missed, or just some point that you think is of interest? I guess the question I have, am I going off course in recognizing that there's something that Jeff is missing here? And something that he missed even in 2019 and 2020. Okay, so somebody says, I'm not sure about off course. Because I see some things here that would be controversial if I had brought them up 2 years ago, let's say. So, now that we have the benefit of hindsight, maybe they're not as controversial because we know that we made some mistakes. And specifically the mistakes would be that we looked at the events that were going to be paralleled by Raffi and Panium as literal wars between Russia and the United States. And I think that battle goes on in the United States. And then what we'd have to do is define what the King of the North is and what the King of the South is. Yeah, and so obviously we need cautions. That's what's being mentioned there. I'm always very, very careful, when I think of something that makes sense to me, that it has to agree with the past. And so we know that we obviously can't keep everything. We have to decide what is foundational and what is something that is missed by perspective. And I would think that if we continue to understand how Jeff looked at 1989 and then how we try to sort through the correction that was made, starting with the understanding of Raffi and Panium, and then the failure of those predictions connected with Raffi and Panium, why they happened. And I think the answer lies in Millwright history. That's the thing that's going to guide us in correcting are misunderstandings or misapplications of prophecy. But in no way do I think that this undoes or dismisses the work that Jeff has done. And that's the one thing that I see clearly, is that the foundation still was laid properly. So we're going to close with prayer, and we'll come back tomorrow with the study of the next issue, which would be June. Yeah, so we're definitely going to have to understand the literal and spiritual and how we apply them in these final events. And so that's something it's going to be very difficult. I don't think it's an easy task that's before us. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we just pray that as we continue through these studies this week, that you can guide and help us to see things correctly. Help us not to run before you in your leading. Help us to be anchored in the past leading that you have given us in Millerite history, in our history. And I pray for each person that you can give them wisdom as they study these things for themselves. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
So.